Welcome back everyone to Wrestling with RahXephon, and this episode is going to be a special one, as it will be a double feature. For this episode, we're going to look at two characters, Soichi Yagamo and Kim Hotal. I think that's how it's pronounced. Seeing as the two are a couple in this show and are really well written, if a little one note, I felt it would be best to combine them into one episode. Now Yagamo and Kim both work for Terra, Yagamo as the vice commander directly under Commander Kunigi, and Kim as a bridge officer. In these roles, we get to know them as competent professionals, and outside of the workplace, we get to know them as a very different, but very caring and well-suited partners, a very healthy couple. Not only do they support each other emotionally, but they also balance each other out very nicely, and also support the cast along the way. Before we learn how they do so, though, let's get into their place in the plot. We first meet Yagamo in episode 4, and Kim in episode 5. While Yagamo doesn't have an episode dedicated to him, Kim does actually pretty early on. I believe it's about episode 7, where we learn about her tragic loss to the Mew, and why she does what she does, and why she is a little bit walled off. Long story short, the Mew killed Kim's parents in her youth, and as such she seeks revenge against them. And this episode is basically about that, as she convinces Commander Yagamo that the Mew are following a certain plan and that they can be intercepted, and she does prove to be correct. She even has a little heart-to-heart with Ayato and convinces him of the necessity of fighting for Terra. After this, though, she doesn't really do too much, although it does persist as a background character, kind of just supporting those around her and serving as a friend to Megumi, a character whose place in the plot is also a little confusing to me, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Yagamo, for his part, doesn't have his own episode, but he does have many important conversations with many characters, and he does serve as an important positive energy to balance out a lot of the more somber members of the cast. Throughout the series, he works directly under Kunigi and basically serves as both a mirror for him and a sort of conscious, and just sort of his understudy. He's a very caring man and does often do his best to get the job done and make sure that those around him feel comfortable. His crowning achievement is basically lulling Makoto into a sense of security enough to get himself fired, which he does very well by basically just going along with the stupid plan for Operation Downfall. This lets Makoto overextend himself and basically get himself fired. This triumph is quickly overshadowed though when, after an emotional plea against doing so, Yagamo has to watch Kunigi sacrifice himself to save everyone else, and thus is permanently forced to assume command. This leads to a more serious Yagamo, who does remain in command up until his death near the end of the series, when Ayato unleashes an uncontrollable burst of energy in his final form. This does greatly upset Kim, who shoots Ayato. However, by this point, everything's kind of off the rails and kind of just proceeds into oblivion until the reset. Although to clarify, I don't blame Kim for getting upset, as it's pretty reasonable to do so having watched your fiancé basically just exploded. With the plot out of the way, let's discuss the characters and what they do in the series. Now Yagamo and Kim fall into the example of perfect secondary or supporting or even tertiary characters, as they do important things and they have important interactions, but they don't take too much screen time and we know what they're about relatively early on. They are well defined and they even have arcs, even if they're limited. But they aren't the center of attention. Their level of personality and character feels just right for what they do, and to explain this, we'll start with Yagamo. Now, Yagamo is a very kind, caring young man who simply wants to do his best to help out. He always is friendly and warm to those around him, and he's always a good listener, trying to do his best in order to make sure that the team is comfortable and operating at peak efficiency in order to get the job done. He seems to place a lot of importance on the value of life, although he is mature and responsible enough to understand that losses do come in the field of work that he has pursued. He's also incredibly intelligent, although isn't very upfront about it. And what I mean about that is he's not arrogant about it. He doesn't need to prove to others that he's the smartest guy in the room, which shows a level of confidence, another good trait. He's responsible enough to understand that he doesn't necessarily need to prove himself and that he needs to focus on the task at hand, and that losses and complications occur, and that he understands how to deal with them. And while he is a nice person on the surface, he does understand the importance of discipline, and while willing to bend rules from time to time, doesn't necessarily go out of his way to break them. He does have self-control and can be firm when needed, although he realizes that most of the time, empathy is often enough to get the job done, and therefore more efficient to apply than the threat of discipline or force. He's not afraid to discipline, but he realizes that that should be done after trying to empathize, and that should not necessarily be the first option. The carrot will often yield more and more easily than the stick. Overall, while Yagamo is a rather one-note character, he is a pleasant one, and he acts as an important beacon of hope, especially for Kunigi, and shows that life does go on. He performs the important role of balancing out some of the more somber characters and preventing an impassable air of doom and gloom from setting in. He's an important character, not only for what he does logistically, i.e. supporting Kunigi and just being the guy that kind of gets stuff done behind the scenes, but also for this purpose. He refreshes the hopes and attitudes of both the cast and the audience, and therefore allows us to settle into the show more comfortably. And even if he does lose some innocence along the way, he is still a very well-adjusted, dedicated, and great character. Now, on to Kim. Now, Kim's entire presence in RahXephon puzzles me, as while on one hand she is very well developed for a tertiary character, and also extremely well adjusted considering her past, and even has her own episode. On the other hand, past this point, she just kind of serves the purpose of being Megami's friend and, just a kind of generic supporting character, which is weird, as she's essentially a support to a supporting character who I would argue isn't even really necessary to the show as a whole. And this sets up Kim in a very weird place as a tertiary character that does a good job of being a tertiary character, but just feels a little overdeveloped for what she does in the show. However, she is well characterized and a sort of role model in dealing with mental issues, and therefore I figured that she should be mentioned here, get a special mention in this episode, instead of just being tossed into the episode where I go over all of the unneeded and underdeveloped characters that bog the series down. That's gonna be a long and fun one. Anyways, because Kim doesn't bog the series down, she escapes that episode and instead is gonna be featured here. Now, while Kim isn't critical to the series as a whole and her place is essentially that of Megami's LV past episode 7 or 8, she is a very neat character, and I do appreciate that Kim shows herself to be a very nice, supportive, and more importantly, well-adjusted character. In fact, oddly enough, of all the characters in this entire series, she's probably the one which handles her trauma the best and most responsibly, which again is really weird considering she's just a tertiary character when we zoom out. In fact, compared to all the other cast, and I would go as far to say in general, Kim's kind of a role model in this regard. Yeah, she's been through a lot of horrible losses, and this has impacted her deeply and not necessarily positively, and she's a little cold because of it. However, that hasn't stopped her from developing herself and making something of herself and being her own person. She is not defined solely by her trauma, and she doesn't fixate on the past, and she isn't a psychopath either. Instead, she's aware of her feelings and her losses and realizes that that's tragic, but also the fact that they can't be undone and that she needs to move forward. She's in touch with her feelings, and she does move forward, and in this way her character is actually very respectable, because where characters like Kunigi are permanently numbed or scarred, which does make sense in this context, and other characters like Haruka refuse to move on and just kind of live in one giant state of denial, Kim is aware of how things are and the fact that she simply needs to move on. She knows that living in the past is bad, and that while she does allow herself to feel certain feelings about it, she doesn't live in that constant state of wallowing. She doesn't prohibit herself from moving forward or taking actions to improve herself. And while I'm sure Yagamo's helped in this process, I cannot state how much credit needs to be given to Kim in this case, as her recovery is inspiring and, in all honesty, a somewhat realistic model on how people should deal with trauma. It's important to zoom out, take your time to come to terms with things, and then eventually just start to move on. She embodies the most realistic, or at least healthiest way to move on from things, and in a show which seems to promote horrible coping mechanisms, we'll talk about that in the Haruka episode, I gotta say that Kim's presence is very much needed, as it serves as a sort of realistic model of how to move on and deal with things. Her recovery is an inspiring one, and it's a much better thing and lesson in process to import to the viewer than any of Haruka's creepy, weird obsessions and schemes. And part of me even wishes that Yagamo and Kim were kind of the main characters for this reason, as while Ayato and Haruka's chemistry is weird and Haruka has horrible mental hygiene, Kim and Yagamo just honestly seem like a very nice, wholesome, loving couple. They're very different, but they're also very caring of each other, and they're in touch with each other, and they balance each other out very well, and they support each other even better. They're just a very good picture of a healthy relationship. And for this reason, they're a better and more realistic couple than the one this show seems to want to focus on. Which again is really weird to me because Kim is a tertiary character and Yagamo is a secondary cast member, but their relationship just seems a lot more wholesome and realistic and relatable in the 20 seconds of it that we see than anything that Ayato and Haruka do, which we'll get to, but I will say now, it just seems really weird and unhealthy to me for many reasons. Alas though, Kim is relegated to the role of a tertiary character and very underutilized. And it is a shame because, like LV, Kim proves that the writers were capable of writing complex, well-developed, and strong and inspiring female characters. But for some reason, just kind of didn't with most of them, and just kind of made a lot of the female characters in the shallow caricatures based on a singular, stereotypical feminine trait. For example, Haruka can't live without a man, or Kwan is kind of an airhead, or Helena's the kind of woman to take the Ice Cube train at divorce. And we'll cover all of these more in the episode where I talk about the characters that were bungled. My point being, though, is that Kim and LV and Megumi proved that the writers knew how to write female characters, but for some reason they didn't do it consistently, and we see this with horrible writing decisions like Haruka's weird, creepy obsession, and a bunch of other stuff that we'll get to in other videos. However, Kim herself is written very well, and her partner Yagamo is also written really well, and it's good seeing just some positive energy in the series, and some positive, healthy mental bonding instead of what we get later on. And for this reason, I do want to highlight these two, as while they are very well known and while they don't necessarily do that much, they are pleasant to be around and they do support the main cast, and they do prove that the writers were capable of writing good characters even though they didn't always do it consistently. And above all, Kim and Yagamo are great additions to the cast as they prove that life and love go on.